You never forget the hunger. It's a different kind of enemy, one that's with you every minute, gnawing at your guts even when the shells aren't falling. They'd hand out these rations, little tins of something they called meat, but God only knew what animal it came from. It was grey, swimming in a kind of jelly, and it tasted like despair. You'd open one up with your bayonet, the cold metal smell hitting your nose, and you'd just look at it. Some of the boys called it Old Man, short for the Old Man of the Sea, because it was just this unidentifiable lump. You'd trade anything for something better. I saw a guy once trade his last cigarette for a single hardtack biscuit that wasn't full of weevils. That's how it was. A smoke might calm your nerves for 5 minutes, but a full stomach, or something close to it, that could keep you going for a day. It told you everything you needed to know about our priorities. We weren't soldiers in those moments. We were just hungry men, animals trying to find the next meal. So we got clever. We built these little stoves out of empty fuel cans, the ones for the field kitchens. You'd punch some holes in the side, get a little fire going with whatever damp wood you could scrounge, and that became your kitchen. My buddy Klaus, he was a mechanic before all this. He was an artist with one of those cans. He could make a stove that would boil water faster than you could say, pass the ammo. The sound of a shared pot starting to bubble, that hiss and rumble, it was the closest thing to music we had out there. It was a promise. It meant that for 10, maybe 15 minutes, things were going to be okay. You de-huddle around it, your hands stretched out toward the weak heat, the smoke stinging your eyes, but you didn't care. You were waiting for that moment when the water would boil, and you could drop in a few cubes of that compressed vegetable broth, watch it dissolve into something that almost looked like soup. In that moment, with the steam warming your face, the war just faded. It didn't go away, nothing ever made it go away, but it got quiet. For the length of time it took to eat a hot meal, even if you were sitting in mud up to your ankles, you weren't a soldier in a foxhole. You were just a man having dinner. And that's when they'd come, the ghosts. You take a sip of that ersatz coffee, this bitter brew made from roasted barley and acorns, and the taste, awful as it was, would somehow unlock a door in your mind. Suddenly, I wasn't in the dirt of Russia. I was back in my mother's kitchen in Munich. I could smell the real coffee, the rich, dark aroma that filled the whole house on a Sunday morning. I could see the sunlight coming through the lace curtains, hear the clatter of my father's newspaper, my little sister laughing. The taste of that awful imitation stuff was a key that opened a room full of light and warmth, and for a second I was home. Then you'd blink, and the cold would rush back in, and the smell of damp wool and cordite would replace the memory of coffee and fresh bread. You'd write letters home, of course. I'd always lie. I'd tell my mother, "The food is quite good, mutter, better than I expected. We had a stew just the other day that reminded me of yours." What a cruel joke. You couldn't tell them the truth. You couldn't describe the gnawing emptiness, the taste of stale bread, the way your stomach would cramp. You had to build that wall, you see, to keep the horror on your side of it. You let them believe the army was taking good care of you. There was an unspoken pact among us at mealtimes. You ate fast. You didn't linger. You shoveled the food into your mouth, not tasting it half the time, because you never knew. You never knew when the shelling would start, or when a sniper's bullet would wind past. A meal interrupted could be your last, so you learned to eat like you fought, quickly, efficiently, with one eye always on the horizon. It's the small things that hold your soul together when everything else is falling apart. I carried a single piece of chocolate in my breast pocket for 6 months. It was from a Red Cross parcel, a real piece of Swiss chocolate, not the waxy stuff we sometimes got. It was my anchor. I'd pat my pocket every morning just to make sure it was still there. It had a weight to it, a gravity far beyond its size. It was for a moment of absolute despair, I told myself. A moment when I didn't think I could take another step, endure another hour. I'd save it for that moment. Just knowing it was there, this tiny piece of sweetness in a world of bitterness, kept me going on days when the cold was so deep it felt like your bones would crack. And then there was the bread. We'd get a loaf, sometimes, to share between 5 men. It was dark, heavy stuff, but it was bread. I remember one time, during a retreat, we were down to our last loaf. Hans, he was the oldest in our squad, maybe 35. He broke it into 5 equal pieces. His hands were shaking from the cold, but he measured it out with a surgeon's care. He gave me my piece, and our eyes met. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. In that shared silence, In that simple act of dividing the last bit of food was a bond stronger than any oath we'd sworn to the fatherland. We were in this together to the end. That's when I really understood it, deep in my bones. The food, the water, it wasn't just fuel for the body. It was nourishment for something else, for the fragile, flickering thing inside you that was still human, that still wanted to live. It was the taste of home in a tin can, a memory of warmth in a freezing hell, and sometimes that was the only thing standing between a man and the abyss. I remember this one time. It was late, 41, outside a village whose name I've long forgotten, just a collection of burnt-out huts, really. The mud was everywhere, this thick, clinging soup that seemed to want to swallow you whole. It was rain mixed with earth and God knows what else. We hadn't had a hot meal in 3 days, just cold tins of that mystery meat and hardtack that you had to smash with the butt of your rifle to make it soft enough to chew, and even then you'd be picking weevils out of your teeth for an hour. The hunger was a constant, dull ache, a presence. It was like a third person in your foxhole, always whispering, never letting you forget. Your hands would get shaky, not from fear, but from the sheer lack of anything solid inside you. You'd look at your buddy and see the same hollow look in his eyes, the same sharpness in his cheeks. We were all fading just a little bit every day. That afternoon the shelling stopped. Not for any reason we could figure, it just stopped. The silence was louder than the explosions, thick and heavy and suspicious. But you take what you can get. Klaus, he was always the optimistic one, he says, "Right, lads, this is our chance. We're making a proper stove." We found an old petrol can, half-crushed, and Klaus went to work with his entrenching tool, hammering it into shape, punching air holes with the tip of his bayonet. It was a masterpiece of desperation. We scavenged for fuel, bits of broken crates, a dead bush that was more thorn than wood, some damp leaves that smoked more than they burned. But we got a fire going. The smell of that smoke, wet and acrid, is a smell I can still conjure up. It's the smell of hope. We had a single pot between our squad, a blackened, dented thing that had probably seen France and Poland. We filled it with brown water from a ditch we'd strained through a shirt to get the big bits out. We dropped in a few cubes of that flesh extract meat extract that turned the water a murky brown. Then the waiting began. We sat in a circle around that little stove, our knees pulled up to our chins, rifles across our laps, just staring at the pot. No one spoke. We just watched the faint flicker of the flames underneath, listened for the first sign of a boil. Your whole world shrinks to the size of a pot. You forget about the war, about the Russians maybe a kilometer away, about the cold seeping through your greatcoat. All that matters is that water getting hot. It started with a few bubbles clinging to the side, then a soft rumble, and then a full, rolling boil. The steam rose up, a clean white plume in the grey air, and it carried the smell of something hot. It wasn't a good smell, not really, but it was warm. That was enough. We each had our mess tin, and we passed the pot around, carefully pouring a portion into each one. The metal would get almost too hot to hold, but you cradle it in your freezing hands, letting the heat seep into your skin. You blow on the surface, watching the steam swirl away, and then you take that first sip. It was just hot, salty water, but in that moment it tasted like the finest soup my mother ever made. It warmed you from the inside out, thawing a little of the ice that had settled in your chest. For those few minutes, we were just men sharing a meal. We talked about stupid things, things that didn't matter. Klaus talked about a girl he'd met in Berlin with a laugh like bells. Franz, who was usually quiet, described the apple strudel his Oma used to bake, the way the cinnamon would smell through the whole house. We weren't soldiers then. We were boys again, remembering a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away. That's what a hot meal did. It built a small, fragile room around you, a room where the war couldn't enter. But the war was always there, waiting. You'd be writing a letter home, trying to find the words to describe this without describing it. My fingers would be so cold the pencil felt like a piece of iron. I'd write, "Dear Mutter, the food here is surprisingly hearty. We had a good stew today. It reminded me of your cooking." The lie would taste bitter in my mouth, but I'd write it anyway. What else could I do? Tell her that I was eating boiled ditch water and dreaming of her potato soup. Tell her that I'd traded my good socks for an extra slice of black bread. You build a wall with those letters. You paint a picture of a life that isn't yours, a life where you're a little cold, a little tired, but managing just fine. You have to, because if you let even a crack of the truth through, the whole terrible reality might come flooding out, and you'd never be able to put it back in the bottle. And then there was the other rule, the one we never talked about but all followed: eat fast. You learned to swallow your food almost without chewing. You'd be hunched over your mess tin, shoveling the food in, your eyes darting from the tree line to the sky and back to your food. A meal was a moment of vulnerability. The sound of a shell whistling in could come at any time, and you didn't want to be caught with your mouth full, so to speak. It was a race against the clock, a race to get a few calories into your body before the world exploded again. That piece of chocolate in my pocket, it became a kind of talisman. It was a small, square lump wrapped in thin foil. I'd take it out sometimes when I was on watch at night, the stars sharp and cold above. I'd unwrap it just enough to smell it. The rich, sweet scent of cocoa would rise up, a tiny pocket of perfume in the stink of mud and sweat and decay. I never ate it. Not then. It was my emergency ration for the soul. I promised myself I would only eat it if I truly believed I was going to die. It was my bargaining chip with fate. As long as I had that chocolate, I had a reason to hold on. It was a concrete piece of a better world, a world where things like chocolate existed. One time, during a particularly bad mortar barrage, I was curled up at the bottom of my hole, my hands over my helmet, the world shaking apart around me. I was sure that was it. I could feel the panic rising, a cold terror that was worse than the shrapnel. And then I felt the lump in my pocket. I pressed my hand against it, through the coarse wool of my tunic. I focused on that small, solid shape. It grounded me. It reminded me that there was still sweetness somewhere, even if I couldn't taste it. It was a stupid, small thing, but it kept me from screaming. And the sharing, that was everything. You learned who a man was by what he did with his last cigarette, his last piece of bread. I saw acts of quiet heroism that would never make it into a dispatch. I saw a man give his only pair of dry socks to a buddy whose feet were bleeding from trench foot. I saw another offer his last swallow of water to a wounded comrade, even though his own lips were cracked and bleeding. We were just kids, most of us, but we learned a brutal, quick maturity. The army taught us to fight, but the war taught us to share. It taught us that your survival was tied to the survival of the man next to you. That bond, forged in mud and hunger and fear, was unbreakable. It was more real, more immediate than any flag or ideology. We weren't fighting for the fatherland in those moments. We were fighting for the guy sharing his last cracker with you. We were fighting for the promise of another hot meal, another day, another chance to maybe, just maybe, go home. That's what they don't tell you about war. It's not just the big battles, the charges, and the retreats. It's the endless, grinding smallness of it. It's the ache in your feet, the constant grit of dirt in your food, the way your stomach cramps with a hunger that's more than physical. It's a homesickness that's a physical pain. And in the middle of all that, you cling to the rituals of being human. You make a stove out of a junk can. You share a pot of muddy soup. You savor the memory of a taste. You find a piece of your humanity in a tin of corned beef and a shared look between friends. That's how you survive. You find the taste of home, even when home is just a ghost in a cup of burnt barley coffee. You hold on to it like a lifeline, and you pray it's enough to get you through one more day. You get used to the rhythm of it after a while, the way you get used to the beat of your own heart. Only this rhythm was all wrong. It was the beat of a dying thing. There was a time for the mortars, a time for the snipers, a time for the machine guns stitching their messages back and forth across the mud. But there was also a time for quiet. You learned it like you learned the smell of the rain coming. Late afternoon, just before the lights started to go golden and long, things would often settle. And meal times were almost sacred. It was an unwritten rule, one of 100 we had out there that weren't in any army manual. You didn't shoot a man while he was eating. It was the one thing, I think, that connected us all, this basic need. You'd hear the clank of a mess tin from their line, 100 yards away through the shattered trees, and you'd feel it was safe to light your little stove, to open your own can of cold, greasy stew. We called them Ivan or Tommy or Jerry to make them less than men, but when you heard them laughing over their food, the sound carrying clear on a still evening, you knew they were just boys like us, with a stomach that growled and a heart that missed home. I remember one guy in particular on the other side. We never saw his face, not really, just a shape, a silhouette against the dusk when he'd stand to stretch. But he had a habit. Every evening after the quiet had settled in, he'd smoke a pipe. You could see the little glow of it, like a firefly, and catch the faint, sweet smell of tobacco on the wind. We started calling him Der Pfeifenraucher, the pipe smoker. My buddy Klaus would say, "There's your friend lighting up." And he was my friend, in a way. His little ritual was a signal that, for a few minutes anyway, the world wasn't ending. It meant normalcy. It meant we could maybe light our own cigarettes without worrying about a bullet finding its way into our skull. You get a strange feeling, knowing a man's habits, the timing of his pipe, and knowing that if the order came, you'd be expected to put a round through his chest. It does something to your head, makes the whole war feel like a monstrous game where nobody knows the rules but everyone's too afraid to start playing. The rules, though, they were there. They were just written in glances and silences and moments of shared fear. I saw it once, clear as day. It was after a nasty little skirmish in the morning, and a fellow, one of theirs, was caught out in the open, in the blasted no-man's-land that separated our misery from theirs. He was screaming, not the short, sharp cries of a man hit, but this long, low animal moaning that gets inside your bones and sits there. It went on for hours. It was worse than the shelling. Then, from their side, a single man stood up. No rifle, just a bag with a red cross on it. He looked terrified, and he should have been. But he started walking, slow, steady, towards the wounded man. We all watched. My finger was on the trigger. It would have been so easy, but nobody shot. The sergeant, a hard man named Vogel, just grunted and said, "Let him be, let him do his job." And we did. The silence was heavier than any bombardment. You could hear the crunch of the medic's boots on the frozen mud, the ragged breathing of the wounded boy. He got to him, did what he could, and started dragging him back. It took an eternity, and when he was almost to his own line, he stopped, just for a second, and looked back towards us. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just a nod, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture, and then he was gone. We'd obeyed a rule that didn't exist, a rule that said a man trying to save a life is more important than a man trying to take one. Christmas of '43, I think it was. The cold was a living thing, biting through your greatcoat, making the metal of your rifle burn your skin. We were huddled in a dugout, trying to share the warmth of a single candle, thinking of Christmas trees and hot wine and families. And then we heard it. At first it was just a single voice, faint and wavering from the British lines. Then a few more joined in. Silent Night. They were singing Still Nacht, our song. The words were different, but the melody. The melody was the exact same one my mother used to sing to me. It rolled across that frozen hellscape, this beautiful, heartbreaking sound. Some of the boys in the dugout with me, tough guys who'd seen things I couldn't imagine, had tears rolling down their chapped cheeks. We were all silent, just listening. For 3 minutes there was no war. There were just a bunch of lonely, scared boys, on both sides of a field, connected by a song about peace. When it ended, the silence that returned was different. It was a sad silence. The spell was broken, but for a little while we remembered we were human. That was the thing. These small acts were the economy of survival. They were the currency we used to buy back little pieces of our souls. There was a night, a few weeks later, when we were desperate for cigarettes. We had tins of meat, awful stuff, but we had plenty. And we knew they, the Tommies, loved their tea and were probably short on rations. So one of our guys, a Berliner with more nerve than sense, stood up on the parapet and shouted into the darkness, "Hey, Tommy, you want bully beef? We want cigarettes." We all held our breath, expecting a burst of machine gun fire. But instead, a voice shouted back, "Toss it over, then." So we did. We wrapped a couple of tins in a cloth and threw them as far as we could into the darkness. A few minutes later, a package came sailing back, 2 packs of British cigarettes. We shared them out, smoking them like they were the finest cigars, and for that hour there was a truce. It wasn't official, it wasn't sanctioned, it was just between us, the poor bloody infantry who had more in common with each other than with the generals moving flags on a map 100 miles away. You developed a respect for a brave soldier, even if he was the enemy. There was a Russian sniper they called the Ghost of Stalingrad, or some such nonsense in our intelligence briefings. But to us, he was just a devilishly good shot. He held up an entire company advance for 2 days from a bombed-out factory. Instead of hating him, we admired his skill. It was a professional respect. When one of our own snipers finally got him, there was no cheering, just a somber acknowledgement. He'd been a soldier, doing his job, and he'd been good at it. In a world that was doing its best to turn us into animals, that respect for courage, for tenacity, was a lifeline. It was a way of saying that even in this, there was a code. There was a way to be a man, but the rules always broke. That was the hardest part. The gut-wrenching, soul-killing moment when the quiet was torn apart by the scream of the officers and the whistle for the attack. I remember one morning, after 2 days of almost complete quiet. We'd even seen a few of them, the Tommies, moving around openly, and we'd done the same. There was a kind of understanding. Then the runner came, mud-spattered and panting with the orders. We were to attack at 600, advance and take their forward positions. The words landed like a physical blow. I looked at my buddy, Ernst, and I saw the same shame in his eyes that I felt in my own heart. It felt like a betrayal. We were about to break this unseen agreement, this fragile peace we'd built with glances and shared silence. The artillery barrage started first, of course, a hurricane of fire and steel that erased the world. And then the whistle. You climb out of the relative safety of your hole, your legs like jelly, your mouth dry as dust, and you run towards the men you just shared a quiet moment with. You run towards the pipe smoker, and you hope to God you don't see him. You hope your bullet misses, but you fire anyway, because the rules are broken and the machine has started up again, and you're just a cog, a replaceable part in a grinding, bloody engine. Returning to the violence after a moment of peace was like being plunged into ice water after a warm bath. It shocked the humanity right out of you. The noise was the worst of it. After the silence, the roar of the MG-42s, the crump of mortar shells, the crack of rifles, it was unbearable. It wasn't just loud. It was violent sound. It punched you in the chest and scrambled your thoughts. You stopped seeing men. You saw shapes, targets, obstacles. The boy who sang Christmas carols was gone, replaced by a uniform behind a gun. And you had to become something else, too. You had to shut down the part of you that remembered the shared cigarette, the nod from the medic. You had to become hard, empty, a thing that moved and fired and survived. Because if you didn't, if you hesitated for a second, thought about the man behind the sights, you were dead. It was a betrayal, yes, but it was a betrayal we were all forced to commit, over and over again. You betrayed your own humanity to save your life, and you prayed that if you lived through it, you might someday find it again. That's the thing they don't tell you about war. It's not the big battles, the grand strategies. It's the small things. The taste of that traded cigarette, the smell of mud and cordite that never leaves your nostrils, the sound of a single man screaming for his mother in the dark. It's the weight of the wool uniform when it's soaked through, the bone-deep ache of exhaustion, the dark jokes you tell to stop yourself from screaming. It's lying in a hole with Ernst, looking at a photograph of his girl back in Hamburg, and both of you pretending you aren't crying. It's the homesickness, a physical pain in your gut sharper than any bayonet. You'd give anything for a hot meal, a clean bed, a quiet night's sleep without the fear. You dream of your mother's cooking, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of rain on a roof that isn't made of splintered wood and dirt. The dark humor was our shield. When a shell would land close and shower us with dirt, someone would always quip, "Another one for the collection." Or, "They're digging our graves for us, saves us the trouble." You had to laugh, because the alternative was to lie down in the muck and never get up. And then there was the day the rules broke for good for me. It was after one of those awful, senseless attacks. The field was littered with the dead and dying, ours and theirs. The smoke hung low and thick, smelling of burnt powder and worse things. We were moving forward, stepping over bodies, checking for any sign of resistance. My job was to help clear the area, and that's when I saw him. It was the pipe smoker. I knew it was him. He was lying on his back, his face pale and waxy, his eyes open to the grey sky. His pipe was still clenched between his teeth, broken. And beside him, half tumbled out of his tunic pocket, was a small, water-stained photograph of a woman and 2 little girls. He wasn't a silhouette anymore. He wasn't Jerry or the enemy. He was a man with a family, a man who liked to smoke a pipe in the evening, a man I had, in some strange, distant way, known. And I had been part of the machine that killed him. I didn't pull the trigger that hit him, but I was there. I was part of it. I fell to my knees beside him. The fighting had moved on, and there was an eerie quiet, broken only by the moans of the wounded. I reached out, my hand trembling, and I took the photograph. I couldn't leave it there to be ruined by the rain and the mud. I looked at his face, and I felt a shame so profound, so total, that it hollowed me out. I saw the wedding band on his finger. I saw the pipe. I saw the human being. And in that moment, the last of the unwritten rules, the last fragile pretense that any of this was sane or honorable, shattered into a million pieces. I took the photograph. I don't know why. Maybe to send it back if I could. Maybe just to bear witness. To remember that in the middle of all that madness, there was a man who loved his family and enjoyed a quiet smoke at the end of the day. I put it in my pocket, next to my own heart, a heavy, guilty weight. And I got up, and I kept moving, because that's what you did. You moved, you fought, you survived. But I was different after that. The war wasn't a game anymore. It was just a tragedy, and I was a tiny, insignificant part of it, trying to hold on to a few unwritten rules in a world that had written them in blood. They issued us everything, the whole kit. The wool uniform that itched like hell when it was wet and chafed you raw when you was marching. The helmet that felt like a dam bucket on your head, always too tight or too loose, and the strap would give you a rash on your chin. But the real weight, the thing that was always with you, was the rifle. A Carabiner 98K. You learned its weight down to the ounce. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a piece of steel and wood that became part of your arm. You slept with it. You ate with it. You learned to field strip it blindfolded in basic training until the smell of the oil and the cold metal were as familiar as your own hands. In the beginning, it felt foreign, dangerous, like holding a snake. But after a while, after the first time you had to use it, it changed. It felt like the only thing standing between you and the grave. You'd run your thumb over the grain of the stock, feeling the dents and scratches, each one a story you didn't want to tell. And the manual they gave us, Dienstvorschrift, it was a joke, full of neat little diagrams about parade ground drills and how to engage the enemy with disciplined volleys. It said nothing about the taste of your own fear, like sucking on a copper penny. It said nothing about the sound a mortar makes when you know it's coming right for you, that whistling scream that sucks all the air out of your lungs. It had no chapter on what a man sounds like when he's dying, calling for his mother. And the gas mask. God, I hated that thing. We had to carry it on our hip, and it felt like carrying your own coffin. It was this rubbery, chemical smell that never went away, and the eyepieces would fog up just from you breathing on them in the cold. You'd look at it and think, if I ever have to put this on, the world has ended. It was a promise of a terrible way to go, sealed up in that bag, and you had to carry that promise with you every step of the way. But the stuff that really mattered, the weight that meant something, wasn't in the regulations. It was in your pockets, tucked away next to your heart. I had a photograph of my family, my Mutter and Vater, my little sister Liesel. It was taken before all this, in our garden in Hamburg. The paper was worn soft as cloth from me taking it out, just to look at it, to trace their faces with my grimy finger. The edges were frayed, and the image was starting to fade. Sometimes, in a quiet moment, I'd hold it and I could almost smell my mother's cooking, hear Liesel laughing in the other room. It was a tiny window to a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away, a world that was getting smaller and fainter with every passing day. And Liesel, she gave me a lucky charm before I shipped out. A little carved wooden rabbit. It was stupid, really. A kid's thing. But I pretended to believe in it. I'd pat my pocket where it was, a superstitious tap, before we went over the top. You do things like that out here. You find rituals, little prayers to anything that might be listening. I'd say to the guys, it's my little rabbit's foot, and they'd laugh, but every one of them had something similar. A St. Christopher medal, a lock of hair, a smooth stone from a river back home. We all carried our little pieces of magic, because the real world had stopped making any sense. And I carried a fountain pen. A nice one. My father gave it to me when I finished school. I thought I'd write grand letters home, full of descriptions and brave sentiments. But most of the time I had no words. I'd sit with a piece of paper on my knee, the pen in my hand, and just stare at the blank page. How do you describe the mud of Russia? It's not just mud. It's a cold, sucking, endless sea of filth that gets into everything, your clothes, your food, your soul. How do you write about the friends you've lost? So often the letter would just say, I am well. I hope you are well. The food is bad. It is cold. And I'd sign it with all my love, a lie wrapped in a truth. Then there were the things you learn to carry, the practical secrets they don't teach you in basic. Extra socks. Sounds silly, right? But dry socks were more valuable than gold. A pair of dry wool socks could mean the difference between marching and getting trench foot, which could rot your feet right off. I kept a spare pair wrapped in all cloth, and I guarded them with my life. You learn to take care of your feet before you took care of your rifle, because if your feet go, you're done. And a good knife. I had a small folding knife, not issued, something I'd had for years. I used it for everything. Opening a can of mystery meat that was supposed to be beef, cutting a piece of hard black bread, whittling a stick to clean my rifle, even cutting bandages once when our medic was overwhelmed. It was a simple, honest tool in a world full of complicated machines of death. And my notebook, just a small, cheap little thing, I'd scribble in it. Not a diary, not really, just thoughts. The name of a village we passed through, the date a buddy bought it, a line from a song someone was humming. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, with the artillery rumbling like a distant thunderstorm, I'd write down the things I dared not speak aloud. I am so afraid. I don't know if I can do this again tomorrow. I dreamt of home last night and woke up crying. Writing it down somehow made it less powerful, like I was putting the fear on the page instead of letting it eat me up from the inside. You had to have these secrets, these small acts of defiance against the misery. A dry spot for your feet, a sharp edge for your tasks, a silent confessional for your heart. But the heaviest things, the things that truly weighed you down, they weren't things you packed yourself. They were the legacies of the fallen. I remember the first time it happened. It was outside a burnt-out village. The name doesn't matter anymore. My friend Klaus, we'd been together since basic. He was a big guy from Bavaria, always laughing, could sing any song you asked him to. A shell landed too close. No warning, just the whistle, and then the world exploded. When the dirt settled, he was gone, just like that. And it fell to me, because I was his friend, to empty his pockets. You have to do that. You have to gather his personal effects to send back to his family. It's the most terrible intimacy. Going through the pockets of a man you joked with an hour ago. His body was still warm. I took out his wallet. There was a photograph of his girlfriend, a pretty girl with blonde curls. I took out his own lucky charm, a St. Michael medal. I took out a half-finished letter to his mother, and then I found it. In his tunic pocket, next to his heart, he had a small, smooth river stone. I'd seen him rubbing it sometimes when he was thinking. He never said what it was for. Maybe from a river near his home. I held that stone in my hand, and it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. All that was left of Klaus, of his laughter and his songs, was this handful of objects in my palm. I had to put them in a bag, tag it, and send it off to become a box of grief on his mother's doorstep. But that wasn't the end of it. In his pack, I found the letter. It was finished, sealed in an envelope, addressed to his mother. He must have written it the night before. He asked me once, "If something happens to me, you'll make sure Muddy gets my last letter right." I'd shrugged it off, told him to shut up, that we'd both see Germany again. But now I had it. This thin piece of paper felt heavier than my entire pack, heavier than the rifle on my shoulder. It was his last words, his final goodbye, and I was the courier. I carried that letter for weeks, through mud and fire and retreat, my own personal mission. Every time I reached into my pocket and felt the envelope, it was like a ghost tapping me on the shoulder. I couldn't lose it. I couldn't let it get wet. That letter became my reason for moving forward on days when I had no reason left. Finally, when we got a few days, respite behind the lines, I found a moment to sit down and add a note of my own on a separate piece of paper. I told her how brave he was, how he was talking about home just before it happened, that he didn't suffer. They were all lies, of course, the kind lies you tell a mother, but I had to send them. I mailed the package and felt a small measure of the weight lift, but not all of it, never all of it, because for every Klaus there was another and then another. You start carrying their memories in your own pockets. You look at a sunrise and think, Hans would have liked this. You hear a joke and think, I have to tell Erich, and then you remember. Your pockets get filled with these ghosts, these absences, until you're not just carrying your own gear, you're carrying a museum of the dead. Your own soul feels worn thin, like that photograph of my family, from being touched by so much loss. The rifle, the ammunition, the helmet, that was the weight of war. But the things in your pockets, that was the weight of being a man, a friend, a son, in the middle of all that madness. And that was a weight you never, ever put down. The silence before the storm. That's what they call it, but it was never silent. Not really. It was the loudest quiet you'll ever hear in your life. It was the sound of your own heart beating right up in your ears, a frantic drum trying to break out of your chest, and the sound of your own breath catching in your throat every time you thought about what was coming. It was the sound of rumors, slithering through the ranks like a poison gas, whispered from one foxhole to the next, from the old hands to the green replacements like me. You'd hear things, snippets of conversations you weren't supposed to hear, the runners coming back from battalion HQ with that tight look around their eyes, the way the sergeants would get real quiet and just stare at the map, tracing lines with a grimy finger. Nobody ever said, "The big push is tomorrow," not outright, but you knew. You felt it in the air, a thickening, a heaviness that made every breath feel like you were sucking in mud. Time just stretched out, elastic and cruel. A minute could feel like an hour like a whole day. You'd look at your watch, a cheap thing my father gave me, and the second hand would seem to stick, taunting you, refusing to move forward, giving you all this time to think, which was the last thing any of us wanted. Thinking was dangerous. Thinking led you down paths you didn't want to walk. So you'd watch the veterans, the guys who'd been through it before, the ones with that 1,000-yard stare, looking for some sign, some hint of what to expect. But their faces were just grim, closed-off masks. They didn't joke as much. They just clean their weapons, smoke their cigarettes down to the filter, and look right through you. That was worse than any rumor. When the old guys go quiet, you know you're in for it. And then the rituals would start. It was like we all had this unspoken checklist, things you had to do before the curtain went up on the final act. For me, it was always the letter. I'd pull out the crumpled, dirt-stained paper and the little stub of a pencil, and I'd try to write to my mother. "Dearest Muddy," I'd always start, but then the words would just stop. What do you say? Do you tell her you're scared? That your hands won't stop shaking? That you have this cold knot of dread sitting in your gut that won't go away? No, you lie. You tell her the food is okay, that the weather has been fair, that you're thinking of her apple strudel and the way the sun sets over the fields back home. You tell her you love her, and you thank her for everything, and you write it in a way that if it's the last thing she ever gets from you, it's a good memory, not a scared boy's confession. You seal it up and put it in your pocket, a little paper weight that feels like a ton of bricks, a promise you might not be able to keep. Then you clean your rifle. Again. The Carabiner 98K was already spotless, the bolt action smooth as butter, but you take it apart anyway. You run the patch through the barrel until it comes out clean, you oil the mechanism, you wipe down the stock. It's a pointless exercise, but it gives your trembling hands something to do, a familiar routine that almost makes you feel like you have some control, which of course you don't. It's all an illusion. Meanwhile, all around you, these quiet conversations would happen. Not big speeches, nothing heroic, just little moments. My buddy Klaus, a big guy from Hamburg who could lift a crate of ammunition by himself, he'd sit down next to me and say, "Hey, Hans, if I don't make it, you tell my little sister that her big brother wasn't afraid, okay?" And I'd nod, and my throat would be too tight to speak, and I'd say, "Yeah, Klaus, and you tell my mother. Tell her I was thinking of her." We made these promises we knew we probably couldn't keep, but it was a way of touching another human being, of reminding ourselves that we weren't alone in this hell. It was a way of saying goodbye without actually saying the words. The last night was the worst. Sleep, forget it. You might doze off for a few minutes, but then you jerk awake, your heart hammering, convinced you'd heard the whistle or the first shell. So you just lie there on the cold, damp ground of the trench, and you listen. You listen to the normal sounds of the night as if you're hearing them for the last time. The crickets chirping somewhere in no man's land, the rustle of the wind in the few trees that were still standing, the distant hoot of an owl. It all sounds so peaceful, so normal, and the contrast with what you know is coming is enough to make you want to scream. You try to memorize the sound, to bottle it up and take it with you. Next to me, France, a kid from my village who was even younger than me, was shivering. Not from the cold, but from fear. I could hear his teeth chattering. I rummaged in my pack and found it my last treasure, a bar of Swiss chocolate, a little melted and misshapen but still in its foil wrapper. I broke it in half, the snap sounding obscenely loud in the quiet, and gave him a piece. "Here," I whispered, "something sweet." We ate it slowly, letting it melt on our tongues, savoring every second of it. It tasted like childhood, like a world that didn't have trenches or machine guns or the smell of cordite and death. It was a tiny, fleeting moment of grace in the middle of all that dread. And then I prayed. I wasn't a particularly religious guy, not anymore, not after seeing what I'd seen. But I muttered something into the darkness. It wasn't to God, not really. It was more to the universe, to fate, to whatever was listening. I didn't ask for victory or glory. I just begged. I begged for just one more day. Let me see the sun rise one more time. Let me feel the rain on my face again. Just let me get through the next sunrise. That's all I wanted. It's all any of us wanted. Then it came. The sound that would haunt my dreams forever, long after the war was over. It wasn't a shell or a bullet. It was shriller, more personal than that. It was the officer's whistle. One sharp, piercing tweet that cut through the pre-dawn gloom like a knife. My whole body went rigid. The waiting was over. The storm was here. I looked at the man next to me. It was Old Man Weber, a guy in his 30s who seemed ancient to us kids. He'd been a teacher before the war. He caught my eye, and I saw it. I saw my own terror reflected back at me. His eyes were wide, the whites showing all around, and his face was pale as a sheet. There was no bravery there, no fierce determination. It was just pure, unadulterated fear. And in a strange way, seeing that in him, seeing that I wasn't the only one feeling this way, gave me a tiny shred of courage. Or maybe it wasn't courage. Maybe it was just resignation. The sergeant was yelling now, his voice hoarse. "Off, Rouse, move out." And then came the hardest part, taking that first step. You're crouched down in the relative safety of the trench, the earth smelling of mud and rot and old tobacco, and you have to will your legs to work to push you up and over the parapet. I remember the feeling of the rough, sandbagged edge scraping against my tunic as I hauled myself up. My boots sank into the mud on the other side. And then I was standing there, exposed in the open. It felt like walking into an abyss. The field ahead was shrouded in a low, clinging mist, and you couldn't see more than 20 meters. But you knew what was out there. You knew the enemy was waiting, just as scared as you were, probably, but with their fingers on the triggers. Every instinct in your body is screaming at you to turn around, to run, to dig a hole and hide. But you don't. You can't. You just put one foot in front of the other. You start walking forward, a slow, clumsy walk that feels like a dream, a nightmare where you're trying to run but your feet are stuck in tar. The mist was cold on my face, and the only sounds were the squelching of our boots in the mud, the jangle of equipment, and the ragged sound of our own breathing. A line of ghosts, advancing into nothingness. And then, as if on some cosmic cue, the sky tore open. It started not with a single shot, but with a roar. The artillery barrage from our side, a thunderous, earth-shaking cacophony as shells screamed overhead to crash into the enemy lines. For a second, you feel a flicker of hope. Maybe they'll all be dead. Maybe we won't have to fight. But then, almost immediately, the answer comes. Their artillery opens up. The first shells started landing among us. The world exploded into noise and light and dirt. A guy a few meters to my left just disappeared. 1 second he was there, the next there was a crater and a red mist. The concussion from the blast hit me like a physical blow, knocking me off my feet. I landed hard, my face in the mud, the taste of dirt and blood in my mouth. The noise was unbelievable, a constant, deafening hammering that beat against your skull. You stop thinking then. The fear is still there. A cold animal panic in your veins, but it's joined by something else, a raw, primal need to survive. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, not towards the enemy, just away from the last shell burst. I found a shell crater and tumbled into it, joining 2 other guys who were already there, pressed against the earth, their eyes wide with terror. We didn't speak. We just clung to the dirt, praying for the shelling to stop. This was it. The storm had broken, and we were just little men, caught in the middle of it, hoping to God we wouldn't be washed away. The waiting was a special kind of torture, but this was a whole different kind of hell. And it had only just begun. You never forget the sound of your name screamed over the guns. Not your real name, of course. Out there you weren't Hans or Klaus or Friedrich. You were Sanitäter. That word, that cry, it would cut through the roar of a firefight sharper than any shell. A high, tight wire of pure panic that would yank you to your feet no matter how deep you were dug in. Every other part of your body, every animal instinct you were born with, screamed at you to press yourself deeper into the dirt, to make yourself small, to run away from the whine of bullets and the thunder of artillery. But that one word, Sanitäter, it pulled you the other way. It was a command, a plea, a curse all at once, and it was for you. My medical bag felt heavier than any rifle or pack I ever carried. It was just a leather satchel, really, but inside it held the thin, fragile line between a buddy living or dying. A few bandages, some morphine syrettes that looked like little metal tubes of toothpaste, a tourniquet, some sulfur powder to try and keep the infection out. That was it. That was all we had to fight against the machinery of modern war that was designed to tear a man to pieces. You'd sling it over your shoulder and feel the weight of it, knowing with a cold certainty that it was never, ever going to be enough. I remember running, always running, my boots sucking in and out of the thick, churned-up mud that smelled of turned earth and cordite and something else, something metallic and sweet that you tried not to think about. The world would shrink down to a tunnel, the sound of the cry, the spot where the smoke was thickest, the shape of a man lying in the muck. Your heart would be hammering in your ears, a frantic drumbeat against the bass note of the artillery. You'd slide in next to him, your knees sinking into the cold wetness, your hands already tearing at the straps of your bag. The training would take over, a rote series of motions you'd practiced 1,000 times in clean, quiet barracks. But there was no quiet here. There was the screaming. God, the screaming, not just from the man in front of you, but from all around, a chorus of agony. And you had to make a choice. That was the worst part, the part they never prepared you for. Triage, a fancy French word for playing God. You had to look at a group of broken men and decide who got your precious few minutes, who got a shot of morphine to ease their passing, and who you had to leave with a pat on the shoulder and a lie. "You'll be all right, camarade. Just hang on." You'd say it, and you'd hope the roar of the battle would drown out the lie in your voice. I learned to look at the eyes first. A man who is conscious and screaming, he's still in the fight. It's the quiet ones, the ones staring at something far away with a waxy, pale face. They're the ones slipping through your fingers. I lost my first man that way. It was outside a village. The name doesn't matter. They all blur together. A shell had landed in the middle of a squad moving up a ditch. The call went up and I went. I found him half-propped against the muddy bank. He couldn't have been more than 18, with blonde hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. He wasn't screaming. He was just breathing in little shallow gasps like a bird. There was a hole in his tunic, right in the chest, a dark, wet stain spreading out from it. It didn't look like much. I got my bandages out, my sulfur powder, talking to him the whole time, telling him to hold on, that we get him patched up. I poured the powder in, pressed the bandage down, my hands trying to staunch a river with a pebble. I could feel his life, his warmth, seeping out between my fingers. I could feel his heartbeat fluttering under my palm, a frantic, fading rhythm. And then it just stopped. There was no big moment, just a stillness. The rain kept falling on his face, and his eyes were still open, but there was nobody home anymore. I remember sitting back on my heels, my hands covered in his blood, feeling the cold mud seep through my trousers, and just a vast, hollow emptiness opening up inside me. A few feet away, another man was yelling about his leg. I turned to him, my movements slow and clumsy, and I managed to get a tourniquet on him to stop the bleeding. They carried him off on a stretcher later. He lived. I saved a man that day. But all I could feel was the weight of the one I lost. That's the math of it. A hollow victory for every empty defeat. The faces, they come back to you at night, when the room is dark and quiet. You try to hold on to the good ones, the ones you pulled back from the edge. There was this kid, Erich. We called him Spats because he was so small. A piece of shrapnel had caught him in the gut. A bad wound, a dirty wound. The pain must have been unimaginable. I gave him a shot of morphine and was trying to get a dressing on him when he reached out and grabbed my hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. His eyes were wide, glazed with the drug and the shock, and he looked right at me and he said, "Mutter, Mutter, bist du das?" He thought I was his mother. He held my hand like a child, and he kept whispering, "Ease tut mir leid, Mutter. I'm sorry, Mother." I stayed with him until the stretcher-bearers came, my hand in his, telling him it was all right, that he was going to be fine, that Mutter was here. The look in his eyes when they lifted him away. It was gratitude, but it was a curse too, because I wasn't his mother. I was just a kid like him, pretending to be a doctor in a world gone mad. I heard later he made it to a field hospital. I hope he lived. I hope he found his real mother. Then there was the one I couldn't forget, the one whose name I carry. Carl. He wasn't a close friend, just a guy from another company I'd shared a cigarette with once. He had a loud laugh, and he was always complaining about the food. We were caught in a mortar barrage in a wooded area, the trees offering no protection, just creating a storm of wood splinters and metal fragments. I found Carl behind a fallen log. The blast had taken most of his leg. He was conscious, and he knew. He knew it was bad. I got a tourniquet on what was left of his thigh, cinched it down tight. The blood was everywhere, a shocking, vibrant red against the green moss and the dark earth. I fumbled for a morphine syringe, my fingers slippery. He looked at me and his face was calm, too calm. Nicht nötig, Sanitäter, he whispered. Not necessary. He knew. He reached into his tunic pocket, his hand shaking, and pulled out a photograph. It was bent and faded, of a woman and a little girl. Meine Frau Main touched her, he said. My wife, my daughter. He pressed it into my hand. Sagen Sie ihnen, tell them, and then he stopped. He never finished the sentence. His eyes just fixed on something behind me, and he was gone, just like that. I sat there with his blood on my hands and the photograph in my palm. I wrote to his wife later. I struggled for days over that letter. What do you say? How do you tell a woman that her husband died in the mud in a country whose name she probably can't pronounce? That his last moments were pain and fear? I said he was brave. I said he spoke of them with love. I said it was quick. I lied about that last part. It wasn't quick. It never is. I still have that photograph somewhere, tucked away in an old box. I never could bring myself to throw it away. It felt like throwing him away a second time. The exhaustion, it wasn't just the kind you feel after a long day's work. This was a weariness that went right down to your soul. It was a constant, heavy cloak you wore, made of mud and fear and the faces of the men you couldn't save. You go for days without a proper sleep, just catnaps in a foxhole with the water pooling around your boots. You'd eat cold tinned meat and hard bread, and your stomach would be in a permanent knot. You'd smell of sweat and dirt and blood, a sour, pungent smell that never really washed off, even if you were lucky enough to find a stream to rinse your face in. Your hands would get raw and cracked from the cold and the constant handling of bandages and antiseptic. But the physical part was nothing compared to the weight on your mind. The what-ifs would eat at you. What if I'd been faster? What if I had more supplies? What if I'd chosen to go to the other guy first? You'd see a man die, and then you'd have to wipe your hands on your trousers, pick up your bag, and move on to the next one. There was no time to grieve. The war didn't allow for it. The shooting would stop for a few hours, and the silence was almost worse. It was in the quiet that you'd hear the moans from the aid station or the sound of your own thoughts, which were much, much louder. We developed a kind of dark humor, a grisly comedy to keep from going insane. We'd joke about getting a Heimatschuss, $1 million wound, something bad enough to get you sent home but not bad enough to kill you. A blighty one, the English called it. We'd envy the guy who took a round through the shoulder or lost a toe to frostbite. Can you imagine? Envying a man for being shot. That's what it did to you. We'd play cards with a deck that was sticky and falling apart, betting with worthless occupation currency or cigarettes, which were the real gold. We'd talk about food. God, we talk about food for hours. My mother's potato pancakes, the way the apples tasted from the tree in my backyard, a cold beer in a stein. You could almost taste it. The homesickness was a physical ache, a constant hollow feeling in your chest. You'd look at a crumpled photograph of your family, the edges soft from being handled so much, and you'd wonder if you'd ever see them again, if you'd ever be the person in that picture, the one smiling in a world without the smell of death. And through it all, there was the bond with the other men, your Kameraden. They were your family. You shared your last cigarette, your last piece of chocolate. You huddled together for warmth in a freezing dugout, your body heat the only thing keeping the frostbite at bay. You knew everything about them, who they were writing to back home, what they were afraid of, the little habits that annoyed you. And you knew they would do anything for you, and you for them. That was the only thing that made it bearable. That sense of not being alone in the hell. When you'd see the fear in a young replacement's eyes, you'd clap him on the shoulder and tell him a dirty joke, try to act like an old hand, even if you were just as scared. You built a wall around your heart, a thick crust of cynicism and jokes, because if you let yourself feel everything, if you truly let in the horror of it, you'd shatter into 1,000 pieces. Sometimes, late at night, you'd hear a man crying softly in his foxhole. Nobody would say anything. You just listen, and in the morning, you pretend you hadn't heard. The act of saving a life, you'd think it would feel like a triumph. And sometimes, for a fleeting second, it did. When you'd see a guy you'd patched up smiling weakly as they loaded him onto a truck headed for the rear, a wave of relief would wash over you. But it was always followed by the burden, because now that man's life was tied to yours. You were responsible for the extra days, the extra years he got. What if he went home to his family and became a bitter man, haunted by what he'd seen? What if he was crippled for life and wished you'd just let him go? You carried all those lives with you, the ones you saved and the ones you lost. It was a heavier load than any medical bag. It's a load I still carry all these years later. You see, the war ends on a calendar, but it doesn't end inside your head. The sound of a car backfiring, the smell of rain on hot pavement, a certain look in a person's eyes, it can all bring it rushing back. I'm an old man now. I have grandchildren who see me as a gentle Opa who grows roses and tells silly stories. They don't see the young man I was. They don't see the hands that held so much death. They ask me about the war sometimes, and I tell them about the funny things, the stupid pranks we pulled. I don't tell them about the weight of the name, Sanitäter. I don't tell them about the feel of a life slipping away beneath my fingers, or the photograph of a little girl I still see in my dreams. Some burdens you're meant to carry alone. You just hope that, by carrying them, you somehow make the world a little lighter for those who come after.